Howdy, sailors. Today I'm talking about something very near and dear to my heart. Stephen Edwin King. I'll be quick and up front by saying that Stephen King is, and has been, my favorite author since I started reading him in 8th grade. I began reading his books as a joke because I thought he sounded insane and horrible. Then a strange thing happened. I fell in love with The Shining. And then I fell in love with Under the Dome. And then I started writing more than I ever had, and thinking about writing more than I ever had, and suddenly I was reading nothing but Stephen King books. I started buying as many Stephen King books as I could, and learning everything about him there was to learn. My favorite novel is The Stand, and I've read it 3 different times. I've gotten 4 other people to read it, and no other book has shaped and influenced my own writing as much. But now another strange thing is beginning to happen. I'm starting to fall out of love with the King. Today, Stephen King is arguably more popular than he's ever been before. The 2017 adaptation of It was a massive success. Netflix's Gerald's Game was incredible. Castle Rock exists and was successful. He's cranking out 2 books a year, and there's a lot more King content coming, like a new adaptation of Pet Sematary and a sequel to It. What about King himself, and more specifically, his writing? Now, King has long been scoffed at by the more prestigious corners of the literary community, and I think this is very unfair. He's gotten more recognition in recent years, and I think he'll continue to get more, and he deserves it. Or at least he did. King's writing is excellent when it's good, abysmal when it's average, and lately, I can't help but feel that it's been average. Because not only has King's writing changed, but it has, I think, gotten worse. I'm not the first person to point out that King's more recent work isn't as good as his older work, and I won't be the last. However, this isn't to say that he hasn't done some great stuff lately. Under the Dome, published in 2009, is one of my favorite King books. Well, except for the ending and the horrible molestation the book went through when adapted for television. But King's 2014 book Revival is also epic, beautiful, poetic, raw, and frightening. In short, it felt like a Stephen King book. When I think of a Stephen King novel, here's what comes to mind. Imperfect, everyday people living everyday lives when something horrible happens. Imperfect, normal, everyday people just trying to keep it together as they face both real and unreal horrors. When I think of a Stephen King novel, I think of pure, unbroken energy-filled story full of nightmare imagery and the horrible realization that day-to-day life can become very scary, and that everyone has their own horrors. King has shaped the horror genre for decades and continues to do so. And he does this because of his characters, not because of his monsters. A good example of this can be seen in It, but more on that in another video. Maybe. I'm getting off topic. What I'm trying to say is that old King novels have a voice which twists together the mundane and the extraordinary to create something original. There's such a deep rawness and texture to King's older works, especially things like The Shining, The Stand, The Long Walk in the Body, which his newer works just kind of lack. Take a look at even one of his most maligned books ever, The Tommyknockers. That book, while weird, extravagant, and not wholly good, is also extremely memorable. For instance, who could forget the flying Coke machine or the tentacles which came out of a woman's vagina to kill a man? Wowzers. I'm not saying this weird extravagance makes the book better, but I am saying it adds something. It adds something uniquely King, and it adds something memorable. And that raw extravagance is either gone or horribly exploited in his new writings. Instead of feeling scared or moved or surprised or shocked when I read a new Stephen King book, I feel annoyed. An example, Sleeping Beauties. I was hyped out of my mind for this book. It sounded incredible to me. I bought 3 copies for it at release. 1 for myself, 1 for my girlfriend at the time, and 1 for my mother. Well, that was a mistake. To be fair, King has written bad books before this, Insomnia, Dreamcatcher, or others, but he had never written anything so mind-numbingly annoying before. And then he wrote Elevation. Elevation and Sleeping Beauties both suffer from the same now-common King problem of being political blog posts first, novel second. And to be fair, Sleeping Beauties was co-written by King's son, and both books do have their high points, but man, do they seem juvenile. I have no issue with Stephen King injecting politics into his books. I'm fine with it, in fact. But King has gotten to the point where he begins writing a novel, then forgets halfway through and switches to commenting how evil and dumb anyone he disagrees with is. For example, Sleeping Beauties is a novel about a world in which women basically cease to exist. Sounds cool, right? I thought so too. Then I was subjugated to 600 pages about how evil men are and how they are the root of all evil. Oh, and it's written in prose that something's from a 6-year-old. Now I see comments coming saying that I just have fragile masculinity or something, but honestly I don't think that's the case at all. If King wants to write a novel about men making mistakes and treating women poorly, he can. And I'd read it. I know this because he did. And I did. In 1992, Stephen King wrote a novel called Gerald's Game, and that same year he wrote another novel called Dolores Claiborne. Without going into detail, both books are essentially feminist novels, and novels which don't vilify men, but make gendered arguments against the bad actions committed by some men against women specifically. And guess what? Both of these novels are in my top 10 favorite Stephen King books because they're well written. Sleeping Beauties is not. Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne are subtle and intelligent, whereas Sleeping Beauties beats her over the head with its politics. And this is ultimately the biggest issue I'm beginning to take with King's newer works, and honestly, King's persona in general. Elevation was not nearly as bad as Sleeping Beauties, and I haven't read The Outsider yet, but Elevation still suffers from the same issues, and is honestly what made me want to make this video in the first place. I could talk at length about why both books and exactly why they don't work for me, but I can just sum them both up by saying why, right now, King doesn't work for me. This is embodied in Elevation specifically, in that the book just feels lazy, overpolished, and above all, bland. The characters are stereotypical, flat, and boring. The term Trumpian is used to describe bad things, and there is an entire section of the book wherein two characters talk about how the town of Castle Rock is bad and homophobic because, quote from the book, it's Republican. Conservative Republican. The county went for Trump 3-1 in 16 and think our stone-brained governor walks on water. Really? Again, I don't have my panties in Swiss because King's attacking or making fun of Trump and conservatives. I really don't care about that. What I do care about is that he does it over. And over. And over. And over again. And he seems incapable of writing a protagonist or good person who's also conservative in any way. This is especially clear because King's books never used to be that way. Mother Abigail, the protagonistic holy figure of The Stand, proudly states several times that she has voted Republican all her life, and even gotten a letter from Ronald Reagan. Would any kind of likable character do that in a King novel today? I really don't think so. Now again, characters can bash Republicans all they want. Real people do that just like real people bash Democrats, or really anything in general. But for King the narrator to do it, and do it so often and so cynically, is off-putting. And not to mention, it juvenizes his writing, which I think is the worst part. Another example beyond King's writing is just his Twitter. Now, King can post literally whatever he wants on Twitter. It's his. In fact, I made a Twitter account when I was 14 years old specifically because I wanted to see what Stephen King was up to. Then I quit using Twitter, and then I deleted it. Not just because of Stephen King, but he was part of it. Every post he makes is politically motivated. The one that really did it for me, however, was when he referred to a train carrying conservatives which crashed and resulted in one death as karma. Granted, he later apologized for this, but really, dude? Really? And the last example is his discussion with George R. R. Martin. I recommend you watch the video, and I'll have a link to it in the description because it really is interesting despite what I'm about to say next. However, I watched this video once a few years ago, then listened to it again, and just recently while driving, realized something. Stephen King never stops butting in and interrupting George Martin. Here's some examples.
We'd run into each other at the World Fantasy Convention.
We played poker together.
We played poker together. The concluding book of the Mr. Mercedes trilogy.
Right.
Which,
you know, I got to say that I'm doing this with George.
They decided they were a gang of space pirates, and the one with the big head was the chief, and the one who was holding a weird weapon was the torturer. I had to have a torturer
basically you're
right
saying
from the first.
You were crazy.
King's obnoxious, goes off on tangents, talks about irrelevant things, and injects politics into weird places, just like in his new writing. And what I find most amusing about this whole clip is how Martin just sits there awkwardly chuckling in all the right places, and then desperately trying to pull King back to an actual discussion about literature.
Somebody who's got only 2 wheels on the road can walk into a store and buy a fucking killing machine, you know, like an AR-15 or something. This is just going to go on. I mean, it's really up to us.
Yeah. I mean, my fantasy series, of course, is often compared to Tolkien, and
George's behavior and attitude in this video really, I think, highlight why I, and a lot of other fans, are beginning to find our favorite author to stick with. George acts nice and tactful, while King is acting like a little kid. This is a discussion which has only a quarter of the literary value I feel it should, and this is largely because of Stephen King. And honestly, that's really sad to me. To be clear, this whole thing is sad to me. Stephen King has been an inspiration to me for years. I've often said that the only 2 celebrities I ever want to meet are he and George Lucas. That's still the case, but part of me is starting to kind of move on. Stephen King always seemed like just a humble guy who loved to write and do the right thing. Now, in later years, he honestly seems a little egotistical, cocky, and arrogant. Just the very existence of Elevation is an example of this, I think. The book is only a novella, not even a novel, and a very poor one at that. And yet it was published and sold as its own product and bought by millions simply because it's by Stephen King. I can almost guarantee that if me, or you, or anyone else besides Stephen King had taken that manuscript and tried to sell it, no publisher would have bought it. It sold off the name King alone. And yes, this is a big part of the business, name sell. And I'm a part of it since I bought the book because it's by Stephen King. But what bothers me is that I don't think an old school King would have done this. He would have published a novella in a collection so that we could get 4 stories, or 14, or more, all for almost the same price. Instead, now he's publishing these things separately and making money off a weaker product. This really hurts me because I know King never used to be this way. His entire Bachman phase, which includes some of his best work, came about as a result of him wanting to be successful based on true writing talent and not just his name. Now, however, he seems fine with simply selling his name instead of a pen, and I can't help but feel left down, and above all, left behind by this. I feel like I've been too hard on Stephen here, and I don't mean to be. I'm still going to read all of his work, I've almost gotten through it all, and he will probably always be my favorite author. And truly, King can have whatever political affiliations he wants, and so can his characters. I don't mind. I'm fine with gay characters, and liberal characters, and conservative characters, and straight characters, and black characters. He just has to make them well-written characters, and right now, he's not doing that. And obviously King knows more about writing than me, but as a reader, and one who cares quite a bit about King and his work, this is something which I think he really needs to take to heart before he isolates a huge part of his fan base. Because at the end of the day, all I want is for King to be successful and create good content. From what I understand, he's a great guy who has done good things for veterans, his community, and tons of charities. I don't think he's a bad person, or even necessarily a bad writer. I just think he's starting to sell out and become a bit lazy in his writing. Honestly, I never want to see King stop writing, but sometimes I think that it might be best for him to take a break for a few years, then come back with one long, epic final novel that will return to his roots and blow everyone away. But that's just me. You could disagree completely, and that's fine. This has been on my mind a lot lately, and I wanted to get it out there. Feel free to let me know what you thought, and of course, keep reading.